Day. Today is Wednesday, 2nd October, and a few hours after my program yesterday was made, we got confirmation of Iran's big missile strike against Israel. And it's clear that this was a much more powerful missile strike than the performative or demonstrative missile strike that Iran undertook back in April. The missile strike that Iran undertook in the aftermath of the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus. The latest strike was carried out exclusively by long-range ballistic missiles. Apparently, little warning was given. There were reports a few hours before the missile strike took place that one was oncoming. There are suggestions that the Iranians informed the Russians and the Americans in advance that the missile strike was about to take place, and that might have been what alerted the Americans, and by the Americans, the Israelis, to the fact that there was going to be a missile strike. But in the event, the amount of time that was given before the missiles started to reach their targets and the initial warnings was relatively short. I guess no more than about 2 hours. Anyway, what was the effect of the missile strike? I think we can start with that. And it's clear that this missile strike, which, as I said, involved only ballistic missiles, drones and cruise missiles were not used. Anyway, this missile strike was more effective, a lot more effective than the previous one. Now, again, it's very difficult in all of the fog of war, in the face of the claims and counterclaims, for me in London to work out exactly what happened. But it is noticeable to me that this time there is a lot less of the euphoria and bragging on the Israeli and Western side than we saw at the time of the Iran's April strike. On the contrary, I've been reading articles like this one in the Daily Telegraph. Its title, and it's by Joe Barnes in Washington, How Iran May Have Breached the World's Best Air Defenses. Israel's air defense system is state of the art, but not infallible. And then we're told that some of the missiles undoubtedly did get through. And we're also informed about many of the problems, which, if you've been following my videos, you will have been made aware of, and by the way, not just mine, Brian Balletic's as well, that there's a general shortage across the Western world of air defense missiles. And we're told that this article in the Daily Telegraph ends because there are genuine concerns about the scarcity of air defense interceptors. There are fears, it's an interesting word, fears, Iran could attempt to overwhelm Israel in any large-scale bombardment. And then we have a quote from an expert, Mr. Hickey. Tonight it seems that Iran launched fewer but more advanced missiles, but if this was to escalate into a conflict, this is something Israel is probably aware of, that the Iranians might be able ultimately to overwhelm Israeli air defenses. And then Mr. Hickey goes on to say, and it's the very last comment in the article, that might be a reason not to escalate this into a full conflict. Well, that's something I've been saying for a while, that it's probably a mistake for the Israelis to want to escalate this into a full conflict, that attempts to create wars often backfire on those who seek them. It's very difficult in a war situation to anticipate all of the potential outcomes and what the other side might do. and that there is indeed a general shortage of air defense missiles and air defense missile interceptors, and that there is always a possibility that the other side might be able ultimately to overwhelm the defenses, as we see is now happening in Ukraine, where after a year, 2 years of battering by the Russians, the Ukrainian air defense system appears, to all intents and purposes, to have collapsed, so that the Russians are able to launch missiles and operate their aircraft right across the territory of Ukraine, with only coming up against only patchy resistance. So I'm not saying that we're close to that point with Israel. By the way, I would take issue with the claim that Israel has the world's best air defenses. I think Russia does, but that's another story. Suffice to say, I don't think we're there with Israel. Obviously, it would take a very long time before Israel's air defenses were depleted in the way that Ukraine's have been. But we start from a situation where there are fewer air defenses to start with, because so much has already been given to Ukraine. And interestingly enough, this same Daily Telegraph article acknowledges the fact there is also the problem that interceptor rockets are limited in numbers. Western efforts to help Ukraine defend its cities against Russian bombardments has used up significant resources in this area. Now, I'm going to come back to that later, because there's a fascinating article which has appeared in The Atlantic, which basically says that the United States should give every weapon it has to Ukraine, not worry about depleting its arsenals, because winning the war in Ukraine is more important, and provided that war is somehow won, the United States will have all the time and leisure that it needs to rebuild its arsenals. As we see, the realities of the world are far more complicated. Depleting arsenals of air defense interceptors by supplying a disproportionate number of them to Ukraine immediately impacts in other places, and means that the United States and Israel have to worry about the fact that they're now facing Iran with a much smaller reserve of air defense interceptors than they might otherwise have had. Anyway, that's an introduction. Let's discuss what the Iranian missile strike achieved. The first thing to say is that there is not much evidence of civilian casualties, and the Iranians are saying that this is because they deliberately attacked military or military-related targets. That some of the missile interceptors got through is, as I said, undeniable, and we are told that various air bases were hit, and an energy facility was hit, and the building of the Mossad building near Tel Aviv was also hit, and apparently hit badly, and pictures that I've seen suggest that it has been, well, if not exactly destroyed, basically damaged beyond use. What might exist beneath this building, whether there's bunkers and anything of that kind there, I don't know. By the way, I am assuming that this is the same Mossad building that Hezbollah has been trying to launch rockets against as well. Anyway, that's my overall impression, that, as I said, quite a lot of targets have been hit. We have film taken by journalists in Israel which show the missiles landing, coming down on their targets, apparently doing significant, well, one can hear large explosions. But as I said, that's, I think, incontrovertible that air bases were hit. An energy facility was hit as well. Very few civilians were killed or injured. There's reports that one Palestinian man was killed, but more as a result of falling debris. But a certain amount of damage was done. Now, the Iranians claim that significantly more damage was done. They say that up to 20 F-35 stealth aircraft were destroyed on the runways. I've seen absolutely no evidence at all to confirm that. I've seen no satellite photos or pictures, and the Israelis have not confirmed it. It's an Iranian claim, and I'm not going to discuss it further in this program. I doubt that it is true. I suspect that the moment they got warning that Iranian missiles were underway, the Israelis would have presumably taken steps to get their aircraft up in the sky to prevent them being hit by Iranian missiles. And I suspect that that is what happened. But I don't know. It may be that some F-35s were destroyed. Obviously, if evidence comes to light that that is so, then I will adjust my views according to the facts. But anyway, there we go. So air bases were destroyed. A Mossad building was, well, if not destroyed, certainly severely damaged. An energy facility was damaged. There is no word, and importantly, and interestingly, the Israelis are not disclosing, and nor are the Americans, what proportion, how many Iranian missiles they were able to shoot down. We're told that that information is not going to be given, and the Iranians, for their part, claim that 90% of the missiles got through. Again, I have no way of corroborating that, but it does look as if, as I've said, certainly some got through. In fact, there's no doubt that some got through. I'm going to make a guess that a significant proportion of the missiles that were launched did, in fact, get through. The United States also participated in the attempts to shoot down these missiles, but as we're talking about ballistic missiles, not drones or cruise missiles, ballistic missiles which fly at either high supersonic or hypersonic speeds. US fighter jets and Iranian fighter jets were not able, obviously, to shoot down these missiles. Attempts were made to shoot them down using air defense interceptors launched from US warships. Some may have been successful. The Americans are saying that no ground-launched air defense missile interceptors operated by the United States were used. So, a demonstration again by the Iranians that they're able to hit targets or strike at targets across Israel, and that the Israeli air defense system is not, as the Daily Telegraph says, infallible. It can be overcome. And the Daily Telegraph tells us that there are only limited numbers of air defense missile interceptors, in part because so many have been sent to Ukraine, and because production, just to add, Brian Beletic has had all the figures, production of air defense missile interceptors in the West has been low, and the stockpiles were low anyway. So what we have is a demonstration that the Iranians can launch missiles, a demonstration that the Israelis that the air defense system in Israel can be overcome, and perhaps, as Mr. Hinckley says, a warning that if this continues for very long, it could be that Israel's air defense system could be overwhelmed completely, like the one in Ukraine has been. Now, the last does need, I think, some important caveats, because, of course, in contrast to Ukraine, Israel can strike back. They can launch airstrikes and missile strikes at Iran itself. If that they can get the Americans to help them, there is no place in Iran, I suspect, which they could not reach. Iran does have an air defense system, but it is not as sophisticated as Russia's. So there is that factor to take into account. There is also the factor that I do not know how many missiles the Iranians have and whether they would be able to maintain long-term missile strike operations against Israel of the sort that we have just seen. Brian Beletic has said that on average, the usual practice is to launch 2 air defense missile interceptors against an incoming missile. The Israelis will therefore have launched around 360 air defense missile interceptors, presumably, against the 180 missiles that the Iranians used. That's a reasonable guess. The Israelis and the Americans also, I should say. In the case of the much less powerful Iranian attack in April, the cost to Israel of parrying that attack was said to be over $1 billion. Yesterday, Israel will have presumably expended even more valuable equipment than that in trying to defend itself against this much more powerful blow that the Iranians have landed. So that tells us, as I said, that the Israelis do have capacity constraints. But what about the Iranians? The Iranians are said to have around 3,000 missiles, 3,000 long-range ballistic missiles. Some of them are hypersonic. I don't know whether these figures are true. I don't think anybody does. There's also the question of whether, in a war situation, an all-out war situation, Iran would be able to maintain production of missiles in order to keep striking at Israel. Though one has to also take into account here that in a all-out conflict between Israel and Iran, the Israelis and their allies wouldn't just have to contend against Iranian missiles launched from long range by Iran itself. They would also have to contend against missile and rocket attacks launched against them by Hezbollah and by the Shia militias in Iraq, and of course by the Houthis, who have recently also demonstrated that they have a capability to reach Israel with long-range missiles. So if we're talking about a missile war, it's impossible for the moment for me to give a clear view about who would have the long-term advantage. My sense, and it is only a sense, is that in the end it would be the Iranians. That the Iranians probably have a sufficiently big stockpile of missiles to start to erode the Israeli air defenses, and that given the supplements, also the supplemental attacks that could be launched by Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, and the Houthis, and that it will not be possible for the Israelis and their allies to keep shooting down Iranian and Houthi and Shia, Iraqi and Hezbollah rockets indefinitely if we find ourselves in an all-out missile war. But a lot will depend on how strong Iran's ability to withstand the inevitable counterblows would be. And of course, we also have to take into account the possibility that in a conflict like this, things could escalate further still. And if we found ourselves in a situation which we are far from being in yet, let me make that clear, if we found ourselves in a situation where it seemed to Israel that they were losing the missile war, then of course they might escalate to the point of using their weapons, their far more powerful weapons, which I'm not going to name, weapons which obviously, if they are ever used, will change completely, not just the direction of the conflict, but the whole situation in the world. Anyway, there we are. That's the Iranian missile strike. Why did the Iranians do it? Well, the short answer is because they had no choice. They've absorbed multiple blows from the Israelis. There was the attack on their embassy in Damascus, and they retaliated by what I've just said was a performative, demonstrative strike. They gave hours of notice. They carried it out with drones and cruise missiles that they knew the Israelis and their allies would have no difficulty shooting down in large numbers. They did launch a small number of advanced missiles, which did get through, but they were careful to select targets where they knew that relatively little damage would be done, and they went out of their way to say that they were not escalating. Then there was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and there was various warnings from senior Iranian officials, including the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei himself, that Iran would respond, but it was careful this time not to respond, or at least not to respond immediately and not to respond in the way that it did last night. And again, there's been much speculation as to why this was so. My own view, and I expressed it previously, is that the Iranians were anxious to perhaps build up their air defenses and had been seeking help from the Russians for this. And I'll return to what the Russians are up to shortly. And I think it is now clear that President Pezeshkian of Iran, anyway, has been anxious to avoid an uncontrolled escalation because he has wanted to achieve some kind of understanding, some kind of rapprochement with the United States to restart the nuclear negotiations and to try and find some way towards Iran getting some degree of sanctions relief. So there's been these aspects, these reasons why the Iranians haven't responded. Professor Said Marandi has also made the point that the Iranians have been given repeated assurances, President Pezeshkian in particular has been given repeated assurances that the United States and Israel were close to agreeing ceasefires in Gaza and in Lebanon, and the Iranians did not want to be the party that would be accused of wrecking those negotiations by taking strong action against Israel, even if the Iranians might not have had much faith in the outcome of those negotiations. So the Iranians did have reasons for not responding, but the fact that they failed to respond was causing immense stresses with their regional allies. We've had reports of angry meetings between Iranian officials and representatives of the various Shia militias, including Hezbollah. And basically, after the Israeli attack on Hezbollah, the pager attack, the bombing and the missile strikes, all of these culminating in the assassination of the Hezbollah chief, Hassan Nasrallah, and his team, the situation had developed where more and more people across the Middle East and in the wider world were starting to say that Iran was beginning to look like a paper tiger, a country that appeared strong and fierce from a distance, but which really had neither the strength nor the will to respond, and which was being steamrolled over by the Israelis. So in order to retain their credibility, which has taken serious damage over the last few weeks, the Iranians had no alternative but to respond. There are some reports, and it's difficult to judge how accurate they are, there are some reports that the decision to respond was nonetheless taken in a divided Tehran. President Pezeshkian supposedly still was arguing for restraint, and in the end, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the Iranian military simply took the decision to launch yesterday's missile strike without consulting and informing President Pezeshkian in advance. If that is true, by the way, then it is proof that President Pezeshkian's authority in Iran has collapsed, in which case it is likely that he will step down, I think, reasonably soon. But having said that, maybe it's unwise to base one's views purely on rumours. For the moment, at least, he is speaking in support of the decision to launch the missile strike, which may suggest that he did, in fact, participate in the decision to launch it. Anyway, the Iranians had no choice but to take this step in order to try to preserve what is left of their credibility. And this time, they had to act in a way that would be effective, that would demonstrate that Iran really does have the ability to cause damage. So it could not be a repetition of the April strike when large numbers of missiles, cruise missiles and drones were shot down, but a strike which was visibly seen to break through Israel's air defenses. And that, of course, is what they've done. Now, the question now is what comes next, because the Israelis are already saying that they will have to react. And I noticed that all the various Western countries, the United States, all of the European states, I think pretty much without exception, are talking about Iran taking this extreme escalatory step. Now, this is, again, a point which I have made before, and which I think needs to be repeated. It's been obvious to me for many weeks now, certainly since Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the United States and addressed Congress, that he was looking for a wider war with ultimately involving Iran himself. He is clearly the main driver behind all of the escalation that we are currently seeing. He is the person who's been making the major decisions. It was presumably his decision to launch the missile strike against the embassy building in Damascus. He must have approved the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. He will have undoubtedly given the green light for the pager attack that we saw take place a short time ago. And of course, in terms of the attack on Nasrallah himself, well, he went out of his way, or rather his team went out of his way to show that he was the person who was making the key decision, because Netanyahu arranged for himself to be filmed in his hotel room in New York, giving the order for the strike against Nasrallah to take place. So it does seem to me very odd, being careful again in my use of language, but it does seem to me not just odd, frankly extraordinary, that Western governments, in a situation like this, where it is clearly obvious which side is seeking escalation, to go on demanding restraint and criticizing reactive measures taken by the other side, in this case Iran, which on the contrary has been the side which up to now has exercised restraint. I understand that in the West, this is a popular position, at least amongst Western governments. But in the outside world, I cannot imagine that it actually is so. On the contrary, it makes, to many people outside the West, make the West look like an accessory to what they will see as Israeli aggression. Just saying. Now, the very fact that Western governments are essentially giving enormous verbal and diplomatic and moral support to the Israelis, or at least to the Israeli government, to Prime Minister Netanyahu at this time, of course, is going to encourage him. In fact, it gives him every reason to do that which he clearly wants to do, which is to escalate further. And that is exactly what he is saying he's now going to do. So we have lots of reports today about the Israelis preparing a massive strike directly against Iran. Supposedly, they're going to attack Iranian energy facilities. There's some reports that they might even strike at Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, that again seems amazing to me, how sanguine people are about this. A couple of months ago, when Ukraine started to launch drone attacks against Russian oil refineries, for example, we had all sorts of warnings from the Biden administration that they weren't really happy with these Ukrainian attacks on these Russian oil refineries and oil facilities, energy facilities, because they were worried that this might affect the price of oil. And that would not be good in the run-up to the November election in the United States. Well, here we now see that there's going to be, apparently, a plan to launch missile strikes or airstrikes against Iranian energy facilities. Iran, of course, is a member of OPEC. It is an important energy exporter. So we're going to have all of those attacks, which could invite Iranian counter strikes against energy facilities in other places, extending all the way up to blockading the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, if this thing were to escalate out of control. Anyway, all of that is being done, and apparently the question of what happens to oil prices in advance of the election in November is one that no one is talking about. So, again, there is, at least to me, an astonishing lack of logic, or at least of consistency here. And then, of course, talking about attacking nuclear sites, what nuclear sites does that mean exactly? Does it mean the nuclear reactor, civil nuclear reactor built by the Russians at Vuhledar? We've had lots of statements from all sorts of people about how irresponsible it would be to attack nuclear power stations. It's been discussed about how that would be absolutely wrong, an unforgivable thing to do. Mr. Grossi regularly visits nuclear power stations like the Zaporozhye nuclear power station and the Kursk nuclear power station, warning about the tremendous danger of a major nuclear accident if attacks on nuclear power stations take place. Of course, he won't say who is, in fact, the party that is conducting the attacks on those nuclear power stations. But okay, let's not dwell on that. Anyway, here we are. And now we've been told that Israel can attack nuclear facilities in Iran. They could be nuclear power plants like Bushehr, or they could be places maybe where the Iranians are supposed to store their enriched uranium, or perhaps their centrifuges where they enrich the uranium. The risks in doing things like that seem to be extraordinarily high. And besides, I've read report after report over many months that the damage that would be done by strikes like that, given how hardened these sites are, would be repairable, and that taking steps like that would be more likely to encourage the Iranians to press forward with a nuclear weapons program than otherwise. Anyway, apparently all caution is going to be thrown to the winds, and we're going to launch these strikes. It's not clear what the assumptions underpinning all of this are, but that apparently is what the Israelis plan to do, and the Western powers are supporting them in doing it. And of course, the risks that this could escalate into an all-out war, well, to a great extent, we already are in an all-out war. It's still unclear to me what the Israelis are doing in southern Lebanon, where they're now fighting Hezbollah. I don't know how many Israeli troops are located there. I saw media reports in the British media this morning which spoke about fierce fighting taking place between Hezbollah fighters and Israelis, and about the Israelis being forced or deciding to send reinforcements. That, by the way, is a first sign that, as people like Alistair Crook are suggesting, Hezbollah will indeed stand together and will be able to withstand the blows that it has received, and that its overall cohesion will has not been affected by the blows that it has experienced over the last few weeks. Anyway, we have that operation being carried out by the Israelis in southern Lebanon. There's been reports of airstrikes or missile strikes by the Israelis against Syria, against the Houthis in Yemen, and of course we now have the talk about strikes against Iran. And one way or the other, the whole situation looks to me to be gradually drifting into an all-out war. And I've been reading reports now, in the British media especially, that given that Iran has struggled and failed to impress upon Israel its deterrent capability, that all attempts by the Iranians to get the Israelis and their American allies to back off up to now have failed. That Iran, especially perhaps if its nuclear facilities are attacked, might go all in and develop those very same nuclear weapons, which the Israelis, the Americans, all of the world, in fact, has been anxious to ensure that they do not. Well, I'm not going to try to speculate too far or to foresee too far where all of this is going. I agree, by the way, with the latest point made by Brian Baletic in his video, his latest video, which is that the United States and Israel, or at least, let me correct that, some people in the United States and in Israel have been trying to lay a trap for Iran, to goad Iran into action that would justify an all-out war between not just Israel and Iran, but ultimately by the Western powers against Iran. The Iranians have been well aware of this. They've done everything that they can to avoid it, but nothing has proved enough. And we are now drifting into exactly that kind of conflict. And I'm just going to finish this overall summary by making this point. It reminds me very much of the situation in the run-up to the start of the special military operation in Ukraine. Now, there's endless explanations given in the West, reasons given for Russian actions. As far as the Russians themselves are concerned, as far as Putin himself is concerned, well, they've made their view absolutely clear. They did not want a war in Ukraine. They worked incredibly hard after the 2014 crisis to avoid a war in Ukraine. They helped to broker the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They plugged on, trying to get the Minsk II agreement in particular executed. They encountered astonishing levels of bad faith from the Ukrainians and from the Western powers, as, by the way, both the Ukrainian powers and the Western powers are now all too happy to admit. They made a major effort, even after the special military operation began, to try to seek a negotiated outcome with Ukraine, leading to the draft agreement that was reached in Istanbul. But in the end, it was all for nothing. They too were goaded into a war as a result of an endless escalation of weapon supplies to Ukraine, which it's now clear began almost certainly during the period of the Obama administration, despite American denials, and also by continued fighting in the Donbass, leading to a major escalation, which nobody actually convincingly denies, in February 2022, which is what in the end provoked the special military operation. And I remember vividly the conduct of the Western leaders at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. I remember President Zelensky's speech in February 2022 at the Munich Security Conference. And it was obvious to me then, at least my own clear view then, was that these people were trying to goad the Russians into a war where they were confident that the sanctions that they were about to launch against Russia would cause Russia's economy to collapse and would result in the Putin government losing control and regime collapse in Russia as well. And of course, it turned out otherwise. And I get the sense that we're doing the same. The same is happening in the Middle East all over again. substitute Iran for Russia this time. Everything has been done to try to goad the Iranians into an armed confrontation. And we are now looking at that very armed confrontation. The Iranians, over the last few months, have shown that they want to avoid an armed confrontation. They've exercised incredible restraint, at least in my opinion. Their restraint has been astonishing. President Pezeshkian has made all kinds of proposals for improving relations, but that has never been enough, because the intention has always been, at least on the part of some people, the people who are able to make the decisions, to precipitate us, to catapult us into a long-term war. Now, the war in Ukraine has turned out catastrophically. Russia is still there. Its economy is growing. Its relations with China have got deeper. It's forged new friendships with various countries in the global south, and its armies are winning in Ukraine. Whether there will be the same catastrophe in this confrontation we're plunging into, I say we, the Western powers as well as Israel, are plunging into with Iran, I cannot say. I don't know the region as well as I knew Russia. I don't know Iran at all. I've never visited the country. But my sense is that, again, this has not been properly thought through at all. It is also, of course, wrong, ethically and morally wrong, to provoke a war. I think that's a point that has to be said, and called me old-fashioned. But I tend to believe that decisions which are made, which are wrong in the way that this one is, goading a country that doesn't want to go to war into war, eventually will have bad consequences for the people who have made it. Anyway, that's my view about the situation in the Middle East today. I noticed that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials are apparently trying to arrange a telephone call with President Putin of Russia. Quite what that is all about, I do wonder. Maybe it's intended as a warning to the Russians not to get themselves drawn into the conflict between Israel and Iran, which is coming. Maybe it's a further attempt to persuade the Russians to slow down on their military support and economic support for Iran. Now, there are strong Russian delegations in Iran at the moment. In previous programs, I've discussed how how the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Sergei Shoigu, has visited Iran repeatedly over the last couple of weeks, and that the Russians seem to be on the brink of agreeing a strategic partnership agreement treaty with the Iranians. There has been a strong Russian economic delegation sent to Iran and negotiating apparently energy deals with Iran. They've been there over the last few weeks. These have been led by government ministers. Apparently the plan is for Russia to export gas to Iran, which is, by the way, itself a major gas producer. And this is also supposed to be part of some complex operation, presumably to build pipelines and other gas export facilities to countries elsewhere in Western Asia, like presumably Pakistan and ultimately India. And yesterday, no less a person than Russia's Prime Minister Mishustin, arrived in Iran. And he also leads what is essentially an economic delegation. It's apparently detailed discussions between the Russians and the Iranians about how to develop their relationship. And of course, all of this is taking place in conjunction with the preparations for the BRICS summit in Kazan later this month. Mishustin is, in theory, the second most senior official in the Russian government. I have to say that his presence in Iran at this particular time, the highest ranking official, is of course Putin himself. Anyway, his presence reminds me again of the travels of the Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin in the 1960s and 1970s. Kosygin, as I remember, visited Vietnam, in North Vietnam in 1965. He was there at the moment when an American airstrike took place on Hanoi, and that led him, on behalf of the Soviet Union, to pledge arms supplies to North Vietnam. He also went to Egypt in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, where he had fraught and difficult arguments with the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, but where he did also play a significant role in organizing a Soviet airlift of weapons supplies to the Egyptians, and where he also arranged for the Egyptians to receive satellite data from the Soviet Union. Now, Mishustin is not as important a figure in the Russian hierarchy as Kosygin was in the Soviet hierarchy in the 1960s and early 1970s. And unlike Kosygin, he does not have a military or military-industrial role. But nonetheless, his presence in Tehran is significant. And if Netanyahu hopes to get the Russians to distance themselves from Iran, I think if he does manage to get through to Putin, with whom Netanyahu formerly had a good relationship, I think he will find that he's coming up against a brick wall, that Putin will tell him that Russia's relations with Iran do not threaten Israel, they're not directed against Israel, and that they're not up for negotiation. Anyway, we will see what happens. My own view is that if we get into a long war, which seems to me now all but inevitable, a long war between between Iran against Israel and the Western powers, all but inevitably, this will gradually evolve into a proxy war in which the Russians are also involved, and ultimately the other BRIC states, perhaps the Chinese too. And again, I can't see this as an outcome that the West should in any shape or form desire. On the contrary, I would have thought that it was urgent that it be avoided. But once again, I don't think any of this is being thought through. I don't think anyone is asking themselves in the West where this is going. Prime Minister Netanyahu does have his plan, but I think he is at risk of underestimating the forces that he is up against. Just saying. Clearly, as I discussed in my program yesterday, Hezbollah and Iran have many problems of corruption, problems of security breaches, all sorts of problems. But the longer the war goes on, the more they will get on top of those problems, provided they're able to withstand the first blows. And if, as I suspect, they do withstand those blows, then not just Israel, but the West as well, could find themselves drawn into another long war in the Middle East, which, from every point of view, I would have thought that they would be seeking to avoid. Anyway, there we are. That is all I am going to say about the situation in the Middle East today. We must now all wait and see what happens with the Israeli strike that is coming against Iran. It could be, it may be, I mean, I don't know, but it could be that the Israelis will get through, that they will inflict enormous damage, that this will provoke some kind of a crisis in Iran, and the whole Iranian setup will collapse like a house of cards, as many people appear to assume that it will, and that the same will be true ultimately of Hezbollah. I don't myself think that, and if I'm right, then, as I said, the consequences will be as I have said. I suspect that people are making all kinds of assumptions which are not based on a proper assessment of facts, but we shall just have to wait and see. On that topic, by the way, just quickly, and before I turn to other things, I saw that veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, VIPs, one of the most rational and sensible institutions, if I can call it that, in the United States, a group of former senior US intelligence officers, including people like Ray McGovern, William Binney, Larry Johnson, all sorts of people of this kind, people who actually had the task of assessing intelligence, who provided high level, very high grade intelligence analysis to the US government, are again urgently making warnings, providing warnings to the US government about where all of this is going. I've seen so many warnings from VIPs, warnings about Russian interference in elections, how wrong that was, warnings going back further to the Iraq war, to all kinds of things. None of these warnings have been heeded. Every one of them has turned out to be right, just saying. I really do feel sometimes that what the president and his officials perhaps need to do is sack all their present intelligence advisors and maybe bring back the old ones and start listening to them instead. I hope, because I have lost all belief that this current administration is capable of listening to that kind of advice. I hope that whoever the next president in the United States is going to be, they start listening to the advice of the people who really understand things. Anyway, let's move on, because of course, even as the crisis in the Middle East is intensifying, we now have that other crisis, the one in Ukraine, which is, I think anybody any longer doubts that we are very much in the end game. Well, yesterday, when I did my program, I said that Vuhledar had either fallen or was about to fall. And sure enough, a few hours later, we saw the flags, Russian flags, all over Vuhledar. And eventually the Ukrainian army group that commands Vuhledar, that commanded the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar, the Khortytsa army group, has now confirmed that Vuhledar has fallen to the Russians. This is what they say. The Supreme Command has given a permission to conduct a maneuver to withdraw units from Vuhledar. That was how they described the fall of Vuhledar. It's all part of some clever maneuver by the Ukrainians. They've just conducted this maneuver, and the permission has been given from the Supreme Command, in presumably Zelensky and Skirsky, to undertake it. The Russians have not yet made, as of the time of making of this program, they haven't yet given official confirmation that Vuhledar is indeed under their control, but nobody doubts any longer that it is. This long-running battle has ended, and Vuhledar is now under Russian control. And the Russians have provided us with some information about the situation in Vuhledar. They say around 870 Ukrainian soldiers have been taken prisoner. They also say that over the course of the last couple of hours, Ukrainian troops repeating what happened in Lysychansk in the summer of 2022 and in Avdiivka in February last year, that Ukrainian troops in small groups have tried to flee across the fields towards the village of that they've tried to flee across the fields to escape this Russian encirclement, and as they tried to move across the fields towards Bogoyavlenka, that the fields are strewn with hundreds of Ukrainian corpses as the Russians hunt these Ukrainian soldiers, hunt them down with artillery, with drones, with everything that you can imagine. I've already spoken about my own feelings about the way in which these Ukrainian soldiers were treated by the Ukrainian command. Apparently some kind of a breakout order was given at the very last moment, and that's why these men are trying to withdraw over these country roads and fields in the dark, in the nights of a Ukrainian autumn. Most of them will be exhausted. Many of them will be short of water, probably low on food. They'll be trying to move across fields dominated by Russian drones, artillery, mortar. There are no doubt Russian scouting parties operating all across these fields, hunting Ukrainian soldiers as they try to escape. I cannot myself even begin to imagine the horror of it. There was a report some days ago that from a Ukrainian soldier, which said that whenever a group of 10 Ukrainian soldiers try to escape to Bogoyavlenka from Vuhledar, only between 4 and 6 of them have any prospect of getting through. But that was a couple of days ago, before the fall of Vuhledar, before the effective encirclement of Vuhledar. I can't imagine now that the number who will successfully get through will be as high as 4 to 6 out of 10. To my mind, this was, and I get to say, a betrayal of these Ukrainian soldiers by their high command. I think it was an astonishing thing. And frankly, I think that if one day Zelensky and Syrskyi are called to account for what has happened, it will be no more than they deserve. Anyway, that's the situation in Vuhledar. There are reports that the Russians are now literally outside Bogoyavlenka. Apparently, their troops are stationed less than a kilometer away from this village, which, by the way, must make it even more difficult for Ukrainian troops to escape to this village. And the Russians, according to the Ukrainians, are on the brink of launching attacks on Bogoyavlenka and Novoukrainka, and there's universal expectations that both of these two villages are going to fall under Russian control at some point within the next couple of days. So we're looking probably at a collapse in this area. I would add that there are also reports that the Russians are close to launching an attack on a village west of Konstantinovka, which on my maps is named Yelizavetivka, but which I now understand is the same village as Yekaterinka, which I've seen many people referred to, but which I cannot find on any map. I don't know why this village has these two different names. They each seem to refer to different Russian empresses, the Empress Elizabeth and the Empress Catherine the Great. Just saying. Why they have these alternate names, whether there's a mapping error or whether this is another example of the various name changes and the confusions that this caused. But anyway, it looks as if this village also is likely to be attacked by the Russians shortly. So, a disaster for the Ukrainians, one that they've grudgingly admitted to. They could hardly do otherwise, with all the pictures of the Russians, of the Russian troops all over Vuhledar. And Vuhledar has now collapsed, and the Russians are now going to be in a position to sort out their logistics in this area, and we can expect further Russian advances in this area also. Now, further north, there are more reports. In fact, there are many reports of what is going on in places like Selidovo, Tsukurinye, if it hasn't already fallen, which it might do within the next few hours, which it might have done, likely to fall within the next few hours or days. Anyway, right across this area, in the southern, in the sort of central part of this battlefield, the Russians continue to make big advances, capturing more fields, gradually working towards the complete encirclement of Selidovo. No sign, by the way, that the Ukrainians have any intention of withdrawing from Selidovo. They seem to be determined to stay there, repeating the same mistakes that they made in Vuhledar, in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, in so many places. But anyway, the fighting there goes on as before. We're getting more reports that the Russians are on the brink of, have captured more ground in Toretsk itself. It does seem to me that the Ukrainians still have escape routes from Toretsk, but again, they're fighting to defend every millimeter of Toretsk, even though they're suffering terrible losses by trying to do so. And perhaps overshadowed by the news from Vuhledar is very consequential news that has suddenly come from the Seversk area. The Russian Defense Ministry has said this morning that the important village of Verkno-Kamyanska, immediately east of Seversk, has fallen to the Russians, that the Russians have captured Seversk. Now, the Russians are already in control of the village of Vimka, which lies just south of Seversk. They've captured places like Sportwear, which also is very close to Seversk. It looks to me as if the Russians are now not only well within artillery, short range artillery range of Seversk. They can probably bomb it with mortars as well as artillery pieces. But they're now well positioned to launch an attack on Seversk from two directions, from the south and the east. And I suspect that they will do so. They will start to do so over the course of the next few days or weeks. Seversk lies at the northern end of the historic contact line between the in Donbass, at the very northern part of Donetsk. And in some ways, it is analogous to Vuhledar. Both Vuhledar, Siversk, relatively small places, around 10,000 people each. Siversk apparently was already in very bad shape before the war. It had been largely abandoned by its people. Its population had once been around 15,000. It had fallen to around 10,000 before the war. According to the Wikipedia entry, most of them were pensioners. There's apparently no major factories or plants operating there. There's only one local bus, and that breaks down regularly, and the roads were already in a terrible condition. That's all from the Wikipedia entry, by the way, about this place. But it is strategically important. It is on a hill. It was heavily fortified by the Ukrainians. The Russians failed to capture it in 2022, just as they failed to capture Vuhledar in 2022. Siversk has resisted various Russian attempts to capture it. And the fact that the Russians weren't able to capture Siversk in 2022 unhinged their defenses in Kharkiv region on the eve of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022, and was, I think, an important reason for the success of that Ukrainian offensive. Now it looks like Siversk is about to fall. It's probably going to be a battle in some ways not dissimilar to the battle for Vuhledar. It doesn't have quite the iconic, almost mythological quality that Vuhledar has acquired. It doesn't have the same kind of appearance that Vuhledar has. A small town of tall buildings rising like towers on a hill, dominating the open steppe land. It's not quite like that. But its fall, in terms of the fighting in northern Donbass, will be almost as consequential and will create the conditions for the titanic battles which are coming once Toretsk and Chasiv Yar both fall, which they will fairly soon, and once the Russians cross the Zherebets and Oskol rivers and capture places like Kupiansk and Liman. The battles for places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, which my guess is will begin before the end of the year. Anyway, there we are. So that's the military situation on the battlefronts. In the political world, I've now heard that the Ukrainians have furiously denied the report in the Financial Times that I discussed yesterday. They're saying that it is completely untrue that the Ukrainian foreign minister in New York, the new Ukrainian foreign minister in New York, floated ideas about Ukraine ceding territory, even temporarily, to the Russians in return for NATO entry. They said that Ukraine will under no circumstances even consider doing any such thing. So the Financial Times article in that respect, supposedly, was false. Well, it might have been, or it might be that this remains the official view of Zelensky and the inner core of people who surround him. They are determined to keep the war going. It may be that the Western powers take a different view. The Biden administration wants, apparently, a period of quiescence, which I find, again, a ridiculous expression to describe a conflict like this. But anyway, they may be talking about a period of quiescence. They want to, in other words, find some means towards some kind of freeze of the conflict. And yesterday, there were reports that Chancellor Scholz of Germany also wants to call Vladimir Putin. So Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to call Vladimir Putin. Olaf Scholz of Germany wants to call Vladimir Putin. Now, the Western leaders appear to have come to an agreement with each other sometime around the spring of 2022. I suspect this happened around the time of the collapse of the Istanbul process. Anyway, they seem to have come to an unofficial, informal agreement with each other that none of them would speak to Vladimir Putin. And that has held. There's been no discussions at any high level between any of the major Western governments and the Russians. VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, have lamented the fact that at a time of extreme conflict between the nuclear superpowers, America and Russia, the United States refuses to have communications at the highest level between the President of the United States and the President of Russia. But anyway, there's been none of these contacts. But now that everything is starting to fall apart, when it's becoming impossible any longer to deny that Ukraine is losing the war, The Economist admits Ukraine is losing the war, the Financial Times admits that Ukraine is losing the war, David Ignatius says that Ukraine is being bled out. They're all admitting that now. At that point in time, when they've all suddenly decided that the moment has come to try to achieve that period of quiescence, a freeze of the conflict, well, at this point, Chancellor Scholz, 2 years too late, is coming to speak to Vladimir Putin, or wants to speak to Vladimir Putin. My own guess is that if he does call Vladimir Putin, he will find Putin, as always, polite and attentive. But I also believe that Putin will tell Scholz the same thing that he told Scholz and Macron in a round table call that they had in March 2022. And what Putin repeatedly says, in fact, he's just reaffirmed it again, that all of the objectives of the special military operation must be met, must be fulfilled. And he will probably tell Scholz that the only way to do that is through Istanbul Plus. In other words, the Ukrainians must withdraw completely from all the 4 regions, including the cities of Zaporozhye and Kherson, that they must agree to neutrality, and that they must make major arrangements, domestic arrangements, scaling down massively the size of their armed forces, agreeing to provide full protections to the rights of Russian speakers, including the Russian Orthodox Church, and taking steps to rein in the various nationalist militias, radical militias, and their friends and parties, which only yesterday the Financial Times finally admitted existed. I doubt very much that Scholz can walk away with that and think that he's going to be able to persuade the Americans, the British, not to mention the Ukrainians, to agree to these demands. Though let me say that at this point in the conflict, objectively, they are not unreasonable. But to think that the Russians are going to moderate that stance at a time when everybody can see that they're going to win the war, when they refused to moderate their stance in March 2022, when Scholz was calling Putin and was imposing massive sanctions on Russia, or in the autumn of 2022, when Bill Burns met Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russia's intelligence agency, the SVR, and found Narishkin absolutely implacable in his determination, in expressing Russia's determination to see the thing through. The idea that the Russians are going to be more accommodating now than they were then, that they're going to agree to things like freezes, I think is a fantasy. For the record, I also think that any assumption that high Russian losses is going to make the Russians more accommodating is a fantasy also. I think, as I've said already, that the losses are not as great as the Western powers think. I think that the losses are on a scale that the Russians can absorb, but I think that they are also sufficiently high to make it politically even more difficult to persuade the Russians to make concessions than would have been the case had those losses not happened. Just to say. So, there we are. That is what Scholz is going to try and do. It's what the Ukrainians, as I said, for their part, being as intransigent as always. Another massive roadblock to any negotiations at the present time, as is absolutely clear to me, are the two bureaucracies in Brussels. Ursula von der Leyen, who has been re-elected President of the European Commission, has reinforced her position by giving all the top posts in the European Commission to people who she can count on as being loyal to herself and who are, without exception, fierce anti-Russian hardliners disproportionately drawn from the Baltic states. The new EU Foreign Affairs chief in replacement for Josep Borrell is the former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who has made comments about what a wonderful thing it would be if Russia could be broken up and made to disappear. These people, by definition, are not going to be favourable to any kind of compromise with Russia. And the same, by the way, applies to the NATO bureaucracy. Mark Rutte, who's just been appointed NATO Secretary General in replacement for Jens Stoltenberg, has made a speech which could have been written by Stoltenberg himself. This speech also says that Ukraine must be given permission to strike anywhere that it wants in Russia, that deep strikes against Russia are absolutely a wonderful idea, that one should put aside any fears about nuclear war, and that the only acceptable outcome for the war is victory for Ukraine and defeat for Russia. About that all of this is unrealistic, indeed fantastic, that it this kind of policy risks the total destruction of Ukraine, and if not World War III. Well, that, of course, is something that people like Rutte and Kallas, and by the way, Ursula von der Leyen, will never accept or entertain. And the reason is not difficult to understand, because both the NATO bureaucracy and the EU bureaucracy are to a very great extent geared now to perpetual expansion. There is a strong feeling within them that unless they can keep expanding, then like the man on the bicycle, the whole thing will fall down. And this has been a fundamental problem, a major roadblock in all attempts to negotiate an end to the Ukrainian crisis, going all the way back to its start with the Orange Revolution in 2004. And to say this, I think Rutte, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, all of these people, rather than compromise on the principle of NATO and EU expansion, would far rather see a total defeat of Ukraine in Ukraine, which they would then be able to argue was proof of Russia's threatening and aggressive character and use to promote both an expansion of their own capabilities, NATO capabilities, and a further deepening of EU integration and a strengthening of the EU centre. It's one of the paradoxes of this conflict that we're now starting to see articles appear in all sorts of places about the fact that one of the reasons why there has been this decline in Europe's economy and society is because of policies pursued by the EU centre, but the EU centre is insisting on even more power and more control so that it can continue to follow those same policies. Anyway, there we are. I don't think there's going to be a negotiated outcome to this conflict in Ukraine. I don't think the Russians really think that either. I'm not saying that if a rational proposal, one that was fact-based and took their interests into account, were presented to them, they would reject it. But very much like Abraham Lincoln's government in the United States during the American Civil War of the 1860s, they will always say that they are ready for reasonable and fact-based discussions in the knowledge that the other side, even when it is losing, is not prepared for such discussions. So that, I think, is where we are with the conflict in Ukraine. It's, meanwhile, dismaying that even as one incredibly dangerous conflict, the one in Ukraine, finally begins to wind down, another, perhaps even more dangerous conflict in the Middle East is starting to crank up. Well, there we are. That's my program for today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work on Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.